Okay, we're good now. I thought it would be good to put some ideas out that then might serve to fuel the discussion. So that's sort of the point of the PowerPoint. But before we do that, I wanted to tell you that several years ago, it was around, I think, 2003 or 2004, I had a 2-year sabbatical from my job at Connecticut College. And I bought this little house in San Miguel County in a place called Las Tuzas, which is where I met Margot, because Margot also has a house there. And I was writing the book that Michael mentioned called Cultures of Devotion. And next door to the house, there was a trailer where this man named Richard lived. Richard was probably, I don't know, in his early 80s when I met him. And I used to go over there. He had like a wood stove inside the trailer, and I used to go over there and talk with him sometimes. We'd just spend some time together and talk. And we got close. And then the 2 years were ending, and it was time for me to return to my job. And so I had to go over there and tell Richard that I was leaving and that I was going to sell my house. So I went over there and told him, I said, Richard, I got to go back to work. And he said, where are you going? And I said, I'm going to Connecticut. And I don't know if he said, where's Connecticut or what's Connecticut, but he said one of those two. And so I said, next time I come, I'll bring a map and I'll show you where I'm going. So a couple of days later, I went back, I brought the map. This is the map. And we were sitting in this place, and in the configuration we were sitting in, that was east and that was west. So I showed Richard the map, and he takes the map, and I said, Richard, here's, it was a map of the United States. So I said, here's California, here's New Mexico over here where we are, here's Connecticut way up here, and I'm going to drive. Okay. So Richard takes the map in his hand, and he gets like a funny look on his face, and you could tell he was thinking really hard. And then he finally said, this map is wrong. So I said, okay, what's wrong with the map? And he said, in order for this map to be right, it would have to be like this. And he turned it around so that the west on the map would conform to the west as we were sitting, because he knew California was west because Henry lived there, and he wanted the west of the map to conform with the west of the world. Now, I think that has something to do with what we're going to talk about today. Something along the lines of, there are things as they are, the map, the world, for us and for churches, and then there are things as we interact with them, as we interpret them, as we adjust them to our needs and our thoughts, as we manipulate them, and even how we judge them. This map is wrong, right? So I think kind of when we look at these slides, that will be some ideas in the background. Oh, before I start, I just want to tell you that I know some of you are going on the trip tomorrow, the tour tomorrow. And the other day I was in the church in Truchas, and they still have all this Santero art there. And so I took a bunch of pictures. And originally this PowerPoint just had churches in it, but after I went on the trip, I kind of dressed it up with some of these historic images. All right. Are you all familiar with Dealey Plaza, where John Kennedy was assassinated? If we were to go to Dealey Plaza, we would see a street, buildings, grass, all right? But nevertheless, we would have an intense emotional response to being there. And if I took you 2 blocks over and we saw a street, buildings, and grass, we wouldn't have that emotional response. So what happens? Something about our knowledge of what happened there, our memories of images that we've seen of what happened there, and then the emotional response that these evoke, all are attached to the place. I think if you think about historic churches, village churches, for the people who are the parishioners and the people who grew up at these places, that's exactly what's happening. These aren't buildings. They are meaningful places invested with family histories, personal histories, traditions, culture, cultural survival, all that's going on when someone looks at their village church. When you ask people, I interviewed a lot of people when I was writing the book, and this is one of the first things they mention is their experiences, their meaningful experiences in the church. Those are meaningful social experiences and meaningful spiritual experiences. So somehow that building becomes imbued with these individual and collective experiences, and then that makes people commit to the place so that they'll want to work on the place, they'll want to save the place, they'll want to prevent the place from falling down. The quote you see on the bottom, "This is my church," that's not a statement of ownership, that's a statement of belonging, right? What also helps contribute to the symbolic or representational meanings of a church is the physical labor that goes into maintaining them. It used to be annual, now not so much, but the hard work of mudding the church and being in physical contact with the church, and in some sense being in physical contact with the other parishioners and your grandparents and your great-grandparents and your father and mother who also worked on that church, that gives people a sense of connection and belonging. I put the phrase there, building yourself in, and we'll get to that in a second. This is a church called San Rafael. It's in MORA County, and it's typical in the sense, are you familiar with what mayordomos are? Mayordomos are church caretakers, the people who take responsibility for caring for the church. In many cases, such as this one, it will pass down in generations of a single family, so that the current mayordomas of this church, their two sisters, their father was the mayordomo, their grandfather was the mayordomo, and I don't know about generations before that, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was more history behind that. So there's this sense of traditional family commitment to the place. It's almost like if you think about military families where people feel an obligation to serve because it's like a family tradition. People feel an obligation to serve here, but to preserve the church. I'm not sure why. Oh, there we go. Okay, here we are at Acoma, and it's a similar kind of position from a different angle. Right? Everett, who's one of the traditional caretakers of the church at Acoma, like people's spirits are built into the wall because of what they had to do to build the church. In this case, it's forced labor, so there's all kinds of other stuff going on. And when we talk about churches, I didn't put it in the PowerPoint, and we could discuss it later if you like, but when you talk about churches as symbols, at a lot of the pueblos, they're symbols of oppression, right? They're symbols of conquest and forced conversion. Another important factor for people's attachment to churches is that their families are buried in the churchyard, the Campo Santo, the cemetery. So each of these is a monument to an individual, but the church itself is sort of a monument to the collective, right? To the ancestral community. I put this phrase down here, you miss one of my aunts. I'm working on this program called Nuevo Mexico Profundo, and Rebecca Montoya, who's the mayordoma of this church, is one of my partners. And at some point she needed a photo of this church, and she asked me if I'd send her one. And she wanted the cemetery included in the picture. So I took the picture, I sent it to her, and then she wrote back and she said, "You missed one of my aunts," which one of her aunts buried in the churchyard, and so she wanted a wider cropping. Okay, I think this is really important when you talk about meaningful places. It could be a church. It could be a home, a school. So your attachment is to the place, but also the place serves to mediate relations between people. Not necessarily dead people, because when you go to church, you're closer to an anthropomorphic God. You're closer to the congregation. You're closer to your extended family that also participates in the church. This is Michael. Michael restored this church for 10, this is in Golden, south of Cerrillos. Michael, without compensation, for a decade, restored that church. Why did he do that? Because his grandfather was the mayordomo at one point. His father, after the church fell into disrepair, rescued the church. Then his father died. Kind of Michael picked up the baton, is that the right word? That carried the torch, and he, on his own, continued restoring the church. I love this guy. He goes into the church. When he rests in the church, he goes into the church, and he sits there and cries about loss and about memory and about what could have been but never was. This is also, I think, critical to understanding historic churches, and not only historic churches, but also the craftsmanship inside them, the art and craftsmanship inside them, and how humans somehow infuse themselves in their creations, particularly artistic creations, and then others can sort of somehow perceive that, so that you feel different in a handmade historic church than you feel in a modern church. Are you familiar with the penitentes? One of the hermano penitentes in Córdoba, where we're going to also go tomorrow, he said to me, when you hold Santero art in your hand, you're holding someone's prayer, right? So again, this interrelation of spirituality and material culture coming together in churches. Now, the epitome of that is what are known as miraculous images. This is, you can't see it well because it's small, but this is the Cristo de Esquipulas, the Christ behind the altar in the Santuario de Chimayo. According to the belief, that crucifix miraculously appeared in the church wasn't there yet. That crucifix miraculously appeared in the dirt where now the church is located. And according to belief, God sends culturally consonant imagery, crucifixes, virgins, to open a channel, to open a local channel to his grace. Okay? So that image is imbued with sacred power because of its source. And one of the primary reasons for pilgrimage is to put yourself in the proximity of that power. You absorb that power by going there. The whole building itself is similarly associated, right? This is a place where lots of miracles happen, so you know that if you go there, you're connected to the grace of God. Now, you have that divine presence or that sacred power. Pilgrimage brings you close, but then you want to extend your contact with sacred power. Now, what happens is, I put up there secondary relics, but the better term would be contact relics. That crucifix appears in the dirt, so then it charges the dirt around it with sacred power. And at the Santuario today, there's this little room. Oops. Let me see if I can get this thing to point. There's this little room over here called the Pocito room. That's the Pocito. Pozo in Spanish means well. Pocito is the diminutive of well. So literally it means little well. But and that might go back to the tradition of it was once a spring of healing waters before the Spaniards came. But anyway, there's the Pocito. This is a close-up. So people will go, you take the dirt, and then that makes the sacred power tangible, could put it in your pocket or on your home altar, and it makes it portable, so you could take it home. It also helps you share. Not the whole family can't make the pilgrimage, so you can take home the dirt, and then you could give some to your relatives. And then the dirt has multiple uses for healing, for crops. People used to put it in their fireplace when there was lightning, and it goes up the chimney and stops the lightning. It pretty much can do whatever you need. All right, so this is just a summary of what we've talked up to now. So preservation of church also entails preservation of all these other things you see there. And at the bottom, I'm trying to stress that the village church is closely connected to people's identity, who we are, what we believe, where we came from. So now I want to go to, just very briefly, to meanings of restoration. Oh, first this. If the church collapses, everything it represents comes down with it. I think that's real important. You're not losing a building if this is your church. You can imagine people in a village and their church starts coming down, and every time they see that church, what does it say to them? What would it say to you? Something's not right with your culture. Something's not right with your tradition. Something that's endured for centuries is now being allowed to crumble, right? So people are sensitive to the implications. All right, so then this quick transition, and then we'll go to the means of restoration. I'm just going to read this. This was Father Graham. He's a priest that started a program for restoring churches in MORA County. And I interviewed him when I was writing the book, and he said this: obviously it doesn't serve a utility because the church is hardly used. But I think if you recognize that restoration of the church isn't necessarily the end goal of having a nice facility, but it's the whole purpose and process of the engagement to bring the community together, to have them engage in a common purpose, to be centered around this symbol of their history, their culture, their traditions, their place, their community, and engage in that, and then to hold that, and then to hold that that is something of their creation, the creation of their ancestors. If you're looking for utility, you could move a double wide out there and be done with it. But if what you're looking for is to be connected to and have a constant point of intersection of all that building has contained and represents, well, then you have to keep it. Okay, let's go quickly now. Means of restoration. This will just take a couple of minutes. First, restoration as a, let me go back here, okay. First, restoration as a form of devotion. There are different ways to be devout to God. One way is to pray, other ways to be active in some religiously appropriate manner. Church restoration, like pilgrimage and other things I put up there, is one way of doing that. Restoration of the church is also maintenance of tradition. The church represents tradition. We have to keep the church together. But there's these two kind of subsets. One is adobe construction. There's this kid, Robbie. I shouldn't call him a kid, he's probably 25, but Robbie works in that project that Father Graham started. He restores a lot of churches. And one of the things he does when he's going to restore a village church is he goes talk to the elders in the village. How did you work adobe? What are the methods you use? And he tries to learn the tradition from the people in the community, and then he has a clear, conscious sense that I am maintaining tradition, right? I'm not innovating. And then also, there's a lot of maintenance of local Catholic tradition just by people talking on the work site about their experiences at the church. Restoration is maintenance of identity, and you can see there both for individuals and for the collective. Restoration is community bonding. This is interesting. This first quote here is from Mac Watson. I'm sure lots of you know him. He used to work on churches in MORA County too. La CUEVA, that one I showed you earlier, he worked on that church. And actually this quote at the top is about that church. Mac said, a lot of community building was taking place right on the work site. He was referring to feuding families, because that happens a lot, would reconcile because the moment came now, your church needed you and you had to come together. And you could see similar comments coming from Akuma there. This I find fascinating. Restoration of the church is self-restoration, and it's come up in several different sites that I've researched. In Mescalero, St. Joseph Apache Mission, the slogan of their church restoration was restoring the building and rebuilding lives. This guy, Tommy, he worked for 14 years on that church. He's not Catholic. He was alcoholic for 30 years, and at his bad times was homeless, living under bridges with other veterans. And at his good times, he was in and out of rehab, in and out of jail, until he moved to Mescalero. The pieces came together for him, and he saw the church, this is consciously, saw his restoration of the church was rebuilding himself. And he said to me once, God saved me so that I could save the church. And you can see this other quote he put here. I think it was a process of me healing, working on the church. So Tommy kind of built himself into the church and then shared somehow in the strength of its stone. At the bottom I put there Doñana, that's down near Las Cruces. They hired gang members to restore their church in a program that the state funded. That's no joke. I mean, those gangs, there were drive-by shootings and everything that gangs come with. Or even in Mescalero, they had an intern program to teach kids how to work on the, do adobe work on the churches. I guess this wasn't adobe, it was stone, but how to do restoration work. And two of those kids, not while they were working, but after, commit suicide. And one of them after killing his mother. So the problems that people brought to these projects were intense. And then the projects, Tommy also talks about how when this is a stone church, right? So you have to, you have these giant stones, and then you have to repoint them, put lime putty mortar. So you're sitting up on a scaffolding much higher than this with like 3 or 4 other guys, and you just talk all day. It's quiet while you're putting in the thing. So Tommy talks about like a lot of therapy going on just during the work. I have this problem with my wife, this isn't going right in my life, and they kind of talk through stuff while they're working together. That's the church, St. Joseph Apache Mission. This is inside. This is another church on the Mescalero Reservation, St. Patrick, and you can't really read that little sign, but it says population 3. Okay, we said when the church collapses, everything it represents comes down with it, but it also works on the flip side. When traditional values, priorities, beliefs, and commitments collapse, then the church is allowed to collapse. So it's kind of an interdependent relationship between the ideas that motivated the building of the church and then whether the church will survive. I put down on the bottom there two key factors in this process. One is depopulation. If you go into these villages, there's barely anyone left. And so who's going to take care of the church? And the people who are left usually are older. So many of them aren't physically prepared to care for the church anymore. So that's a major problem. The other problem is centralization of masses and sacraments. I'll use San Miguel County as an example. San Miguel County has 19 village churches, and it probably has 1 or 2 priests. So they're saying, okay, we don't have the resources to come to you anymore and give masses in those village churches. So now everyone's going to come to the mother church for masses, for sacraments, for funerals, right? But as soon as you do that, then the village churches become even more obsolete because now they're not even being used for mass. This is just very briefly, this is just to show you how things have changed in terms of attitudes toward church restoration. It used to be like, this is Sam up at the top, it's a reference to Sam Baca, some of you might know him. He worked for Cornerstones at the beginning, and he described it as a barn-raising spirit, right? Everyone comes out, wants to fix the church. Now, I'll just read the first line, it's sad, and that kind of covers it. But people don't want to work on churches for free anymore. This is very interesting too. This is at Picaris Pueblo. This is Richard, a former governor, and he talks about how once stucco was put on the churches, it broke the tradition of annual remudding the church. And then once you've broken that tradition, then it was hard to revive it again because people just got used to, over a period of 20 or 30 years, that we don't work on the church anymore. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much. So we can turn this off, if I can figure out how.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead. Okay, go.
The fan will go well there. Let me just open with a quick question, Frank.
Yeah.
You know, the standard gloss on the difference between indigenous religions and world religions is that indigenous religions are very focused on place, and they celebrate and sacralize the place where people are living and have lived for generations. World religions, you know, Judaism, Islam, Catholicism, or Christianity, are portable religions, and they're oriented to space. I mean, obviously Mecca or Jerusalem or Rome, but the fact is you can plunk a synagogue or a temple or a mosque down anywhere, which is one of the reasons why they're so powerful. But what you're talking about is something that's kind of a hybrid. I mean, this is a world religion, but I mean, do I have that right? But it celebrates placeness, I guess.
You have that exactly right. Yeah, it's incredible. I'd never thought of that, but it's exactly right. This is place-dependent religious belief. And even if you think about adobe churches, they're dependent on their context for meaning. Like if you took an adobe church and you put it in Pennsylvania or in the Bronx or in Vatican City, it loses the charm. It just seems poor and humble. And here, where they seem to have emerged from the earth that they're made out of, they seem so integral to the environment. I think a lot of their charm is dependent on the natural and the cultural context around them. Should we pass this, or how you want to do this?
I have a question about what you said. What about, you're talking about depopulation, so what about the kids that are leaving and going to the city that grew up in those village churches? Don't they carry it with them? I mean, somebody that grew up in a mosque in Iran or wherever, when they moved to the United States, I mean, what's the similarity there? What?
I took it off. I understand. Do you understand the question? The question is like, when people leave the villages, young people, and that's who leaves the villages, because they go out and look for their fortune, right? They go out and look for their life, their adventure. And they go to the city, they go to Albuquerque or California. Do they still maintain an attachment to their church? And the answer to that question is it varies wildly, even within the same family. In Spanish, there's this concept called la querencia. La querencia is a love of place, a love of cultural place. And la carencia is nurtured, fomented within some families throughout from the time that the kids are born. And those kids who grow up with the idea of appreciation for their village and their village church might take it with them wherever they go. And then they'll come back for feast days, for example, which is very common. Others don't have that sense of attachment. Sometimes the attachment is lifelong. I remember I interviewed this woman in Buena Vista, in MORA County, and she said, my father's from Chacon, another town in MORA County, and he's been living in Buena Vista. He married her mother. She was from Buena Vista. He's been living in Buena Vista for 40 years, but Chacon is still his church. Remember I talked about that concept of my church? Chacon is still his church. Why? Because he grew up with that attachment, the attachment to that church, and now he might attend another church, but he still feels an emotional, a permanent emotional connection to that place. So it's going to vary.
Along those lines, if at the Santuario de Chimayo, they replace the dirt that is taken out, does that new dirt have to be consecrated by a priest before it's put in the little well, or is the process of just putting it in the well?
All right, there are different answers to that question. First of all, that dirt is just from, it's nearby dirt. In the past, it's come from Lowe's in Española, but now it's nearby dirt that is blessed by Father Julio, the pastor of the Santuario de Chimayo. But that's not really why it has sacred power. Well, I'm talking about traditional belief. I'm sure this has changed a lot. Let me talk about Mexico, for example. If this were in Mexico, the reason it has sacred power is once you put it in that place where the cross has appeared, even though a century has passed or millennia has passed, it's in the sacred grounds that the crucifix appeared, so it's going to have contact somehow with that and become sacred. Now, according to traditional belief in New Mexico, the pocito refills miraculously with dirt, right? People think that they don't think that it's filled, they think that it replenishes miraculously because that's part of the miracle of the dirt. And Father Julio, the pastor at the Santuario, he's clear about, we don't mislead anyone. We put in front of everybody, we go there and we fill up the thing. But the traditional belief still prevails, right? People are going to believe that. I want to make another comment on this topic that I think is real interesting. In Mexico, in the state of Veracruz, near Oaxaca, the border of the Oaxaca state, there's another santuario. Santuario is the Spanish word for shrine. There's another santuario called Cristo de Otatitlan. Excuse me. When the Mexican government was attacking the Catholic religion in the 1920s, they stole the crucifix from the church, this Christ of Otatitlan. They took him to the river and they tried to burn it because they thought this imagery was moving the socialist trend that they were doing at the time. Okay, so they tried to burn the Christ of Otatitlan. That didn't work, so instead they sawed off his head. Now, when they sawed off his head, according to the popular belief, his blood, even though it's a statue, because it's a miraculous image, his blood infused the dirt there. So now every year, when thousands of people come on pilgrimage, they dig the dirt at the spot where the sacred power, by contact with the sacred blood, went into the dirt. So it got to the point where there was like a monument there, to indicate the spot where the profanation had happened. And it got to the point where the monument was going to topple over. This happened at the Santuario too, that's why they put in the flagstone floor. It got to a point where the monuments could topple over, so they put like a cement slab and put the monument on top of it. And now if you go there, it's kind of excavated underneath the slab to get to the spot where the sacred dirt is.
Well, I've got a question. One of the things you talk about in your book, but it's worth discussing here because not everybody's seen the book, is the tension between the church and folk Catholicism. And it's changed over time. Obviously, priests did everything they could in the early days to suppress native religion. And then later on, there seemed to be more of a willingness to accommodate. And as you know, in Latin America, you get these sort of syncretized indigenous and traditional Catholic rituals. And so what's your sense of where things are now? I got the impression from your book that partly because it's so hard to actually staff these churches, the priests are a lot more indulgent about local practices that are not exactly orthodox.
Well, kind of divide that into native and Hispanic. On the native side, syncretism is the intermixing of religions. So you have in this case Catholic beliefs, native beliefs, and they'll just kind of, over the centuries, fuse in different ways in deities, in prayer, in rituals, feast day celebrations. You'll see kind of overlapping or integration of two different beliefs. That's among the Pueblos. Among the Apaches, who you saw there, Mescalero, they're very different. I'm sorry, That's among the Apaches. Among the Pueblos, they're very different. The Pueblos, instead of syncretizing, keep the two traditions parallel, right? They practice both traditions, but they're parallel. So just so I'm clear, because I made the mistake, the Apaches tend more toward syncretism, and the Pueblos more toward keeping it parallel. The degree of tolerance among priests varies person to parish and person to person. So there's no constant. It depends who's in charge, and the rules can change radically when a new pastor is appointed to the church, and that causes all kinds of problems. The Franciscans have tended to be much more tolerant than the diocesan priests. So that's that. Now on the other side, on the Hispanic side, there's not, well, I'm thinking a couple of things. First thing, like there's this village of Cordoba that we're going to go there tomorrow too, that has rituals, important rituals that the whole community comes to and no priest is involved, right? Now, you could tell Father Julio, who's the pastor in that parish, he's not real comfortable with that. But then you take a place like MORA, where they have 16 village churches in one parish, and the priest can't possibly do everything. So they're encouraging the mayordomos to do Catholic events in their missions without a priest. So for example, at Santa Teresita, they'll do a pilgrimage on Good Friday. Or some of the missions, May is the month of Mary, so some of the missions will do prayer events. Or some of the missions will invite hermanos penitentes to come and do things with alabados. So again, it varies, the degree of tolerance varies. We were speaking earlier about the Franciscan Chronicles. There's an archive in Albuquerque, Franciscan archive, and the priests are supposed to, the Franciscan pastors were supposed to keep daily chronicles. This happened today, this whatever. Some did, some didn't, some wrote a sentence, some wrote a page. But when I was researching, I went down and I looked at those, and you can see them agonizing through how tolerant they were going to be at the Indian pueblos to different kinds of religious practices. And also another thing you saw was a struggle for consistency. Like, how can we allow this to happen at one pueblo while at the same time we're restricting it at the other pueblo? So it's kind of a mixed situation. Yes.
I have a question. Can you tell me what's currently going on in Cordoba? You mentioned the sometimes priest, sometimes no priest, but I was with the first group of Anglos that moved to Cordoba in 1970, and the MORA had been abandoned already. And so maybe that has something to do with what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. The MORA is strong in Cordoba now. And I'm going to say this very briefly because I'm going to talk about tomorrow, and I know some of you are coming, and I don't want to be redundant. But they do, the event I was referring to is on Holy Thursday and Good Friday at night. It's called, in Spanish it's called tinieblas. In English it's called, we use the Latin word, it's called tenebrae. And after Vatican II it was eliminated, but some places still do it. But it's the most amazing thing. You're in that church, it's full of people. The hermanos come in procession. They go up to the altar where there are 13 candles, and they do these rituals, and they one by one extinguish the candle until they get to the Christ candle in the center, and then they extinguish that candle. And as soon as they extinguish that candle, they make all kinds of noise, banging a chain in the choir loft. Like one guy was banging a brake drum, ratchet, whistles, to suggest, to symbolize the calamity at the death of Christ. And so I'll leave it at that, but that ritual still goes on. And I thought, for me, like, I'm used to going to empty churches, basically. No one shows up anymore at most, even at feast days, no one shows up. And In village churches in general. You go to feast day and only a few people show up, whereas that would have been a main annual event, 50 years ago. And to go into that Cordova church and have it packed with families, kids, teenagers, everybody, and everybody participating, I found that incredible. Did you want to say something else? Yeah. I think it revived because the morada revived, the brotherhood revived. And near where I live, there's a town called Peñasco, and the morada is growing there. It's like certain traditions can become cool again for young people, for lack of a better word. And I've heard at the Indian Pueblo, at Laguna, for example, that more young people are coming into the CUEVA because they think now they want their Indian identity. And in the Hispanic villages, after like a precipitous decline of hermano participation, now it seems like, at least near where I live, it seems like it's growing again. So once that happens, then you see an effort for recuperation of tradition. There was a question over here, I think. Thank you.
One of the things that caught my attention for this lecture was restoration. And maybe a few months ago, I had a conversation with some friends. Maybe we took it to a different level. When we talk about restoration, we think about sin and repairing. We are the Catholic Church teaches us our bodies are temple of the Holy Spirit. So how do we become holy, and how do we clean ourselves and be free of sin? So by the fact that we are restoring by penance, by confession, to the full grace, in the grace of God, in a similar way, we had conversations about churches and how in our lifetime, in the last, I want to say, because of our age, 50 years, how much have the church changed? And we looked at restorations by saying, well, we can pray anywhere. We don't need a physical building. We can get together under a tree or the beach and say mass and have everything. But it's about the sacredness of the space that you mentioned before. It's about the surroundings that it kind of surrounds us and makes it holy, I guess. That is interesting to me. But and how you mentioned that churches are being empty. And what to do and what the church is considering doing to bring people back, and I think it's a timing of what they do to bring people back to the church.
I love that the restoration, those restoration thoughts. They were a little bit, I mean, they're different, but they were similar to the idea of self-restoration as church restoration, except you were doing it the other way around, right? I could lose my entire identity with this. Well, you get the point, yeah. Yes.
Some years back, I went into the office of Cornerstones to make a contribution, and got to talking with the young Hispanic man who was processing these things, and he thanked me for the contribution. And I said, I thought maybe it was in part an atonement for bringing my New York Anglo-ness here to dilute the Hispanic history and culture. And he said, no, don't feel that way. If it weren't for people like you, we wouldn't be able to do this kind of work. So I just wonder, given your comments and many of the others, if you would just comment on that interchange.
Well, this is an area of three cultures. Everyone knows that. And sometimes there are interesting crossovers. One that just popped into my mind is there was a Jewish businessman. His name was, I can't remember his first name. His last name was Bibo, and there's a town called Bibo. And, was it Jim? And there's a bar there now. He came here, well, it's got to be over a century ago. I can't remember, sometime in the 19th century, and he became the governor of Acoma Pueblo. So now you have,
He married in.
He married in, yeah, exactly. And the same thing happened at Laguna with two brothers who were both married in, and they weren't Jewish, but they were Presbyterian, I think. And so a lot of times, and you know, I'm as Anglo as anyone in, well, not Anglo, I'm Italian, but you know, foreign as anyone in the room. And one of the things I discovered doing this research is if you behave appropriately, people will accept you and will love you no matter, you know, no matter what you are, if you come in from outside. I remember I talked about Richard when I began this talk, and I would sit there with Richard in his trailer, and some other guys would come by, you know, every once in a while someone would come by for a visit, and they'd be saying, white people this, white people that, you know, white people this, and I'm sitting there, but I wasn't white people anymore, you know, I was one of them. So, I don't know if that really answered your question, but the idea is that I think you could maintain difference and at the same time have community. Yes. I'm going to sneak behind you and grab some water.
Okay. You referenced some efforts by some of the parishes to really use the churches as community centers for activities that are compatible in the setting. And how successful has that been? Is there resistance among some parishes, adoption among others, and what do you think is going to be the outcome of those efforts?
Yeah, that's great. When I was doing the research for this project, I would ask people about that. I said, like, your church is open for Mass twice a year. This is a common situation, sometimes 3 times. And otherwise it just sits there empty. So would it make sense to use the church for other things? Some people were receptive, other people resisted that idea. I recently started this program, it's called Nuevo Mexico Profundo, precisely to do what you're talking about. We're organizing tours and concerts in the churches to raise funds for the churches. And I didn't know, frankly, if the parishes and the mayordomos would accept that idea. And we started with the Santuario de Chimayo, Father Julio, and I went down and I talked to him, and I said, this is what we're thinking. You know, I don't know if he's going to throw me out on my ear or, you know, how it would play, but he was receptive. And then we had a meeting, he called a meeting with the committees and the mayordomos, and we talked it through, and they were receptive. And then we did the same thing in MORA. So I think something has to happen to make the church, I'm talking my own personal opinion, something has to happen to make the churches vital so that they're not sitting there empty all the time in order for them to be preserved. Because the villages are essentially depopulated. There's one church, it was in the first slide up there, I should have indicated it. It's called San Agustin. It's near Las Vegas, New Mexico, in this beautiful, beautiful valley called Rio Gallinas, the valley of the Rio Gallinas. That church is on its way to ruin. That village it's a stone, mostly stone village. Spectacular setting. But there's no one there to go to church. Another issue that I'll mention very briefly is insurance. The parishes are displacing the cost of insurance now onto the mayordomos, onto the villages, onto the individual churches. So you have a poor mayordomo or mayordoma who has to care for the church, maintenance on that, and now has to fundraise to pay the insurance. So one by one, people tire of that because it's just too much of a burden. And then once they stop paying their insurance, their church is closed. And once the church is closed, then it begins to slow decline. Now, one last point on your question is some churches have been desacralized in order to become event venues. I'll give you an example, for example, San Isidro in Corrales, right? Now, why does that happen? They build a new church where that's going to be the religious center. Now we have this beautiful old church. What are we going to do? Instead of leaving it empty, it becomes a concert venue, and it's open for tours, and I'm sure that generates some revenue. And San Miguel Chapel is sort of halfway that way too. Yes?
So how do these people react? It's sort of like they're just throwing them aside, saying, we're not going to help, we don't have any money, when the Catholic Church in Rome sits with billions of dollars of assets, and then all this other stuff that's going on in the church nowadays, and so on. Doesn't any of this make them angry that they're being deserted and left and they don't give a hoot about them, or?
Yeah, absolutely. In MORA last year, they started charging the insurance, and there was outrage. I mean, there was outrage. People were deeply upset about it. The Archdiocese isn't going to put any money in those churches. That has become clear. Now, even less, because it's in Chapter 11 because of all the sexual abuse. So they're not going to save those churches. Now, I have to say that a lot of churches are in pretty good shape still. So when I talk about, when I give my doom and gloom discourse, it's looking down the road, because I see what's happening primarily because most of the people who care about the churches in the villages are older, and they all wonder what's going to happen when I'm not here anymore, is basically what people are thinking. Yes?
Yeah, I wish you would expand on that, the question of what are you saving the churches for if nobody's using them for religious ceremonies and their, concert venues? Why are you saving them?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'll tell you my personal response. I think they need to be saved because they're patrimony and cultural heritage. Like, we would never say, why are we saving those buildings in Bandelier? No one lives there anymore. Or, why Chaco Canyon, that doesn't really serve any purpose. Why don't we just get rid of that? My sense is the history, the landscape, the tourism of New Mexico are dependent on some kind of integral traditional culture. And those churches are sort of the centerpiece, in my view, of that kind of culture. Also, they're all that's left of that culture. Like, if you look at a place like Las Trampas, for example, where there's the beautiful San Jose, that used to be like the rest of New Mexico, and you could sort of see it a little bit in Plaza del Cerro and also in Cerrillos near the Colorado border. That used to be a walled, enclosed village, right? Like all these villages to protect from Comanche attacks, protect from Apache attacks. There was the church. There were low adobe houses with no windows on the exterior. There was one entrance where the livestock was herded when there was an attack. And until, I have a guidebook of New Mexico from the 30s, that walled village of Las Trampas was there then. If in an article in the 1980s, there was parts of it there then. That village is completely, that walled enclosure, that traditional village is completely gone now. The only thing that got saved was the church, because faith was strong enough to keep that going. And also, participation of the Archdiocese was much more active in previous decades. So the churches are really all that's left of traditional architecture and traditional village settlement in the state. So for me personally, I don't care if they're used. I care that they're saved. I saw there's one behind you. Let's get one and we'll come back to you.
You didn't say too much more about the cemeteries, but I was up at Las Trampas in another hopeless attempt to see the interior, which is why I'm going tomorrow. And there was a brand new grave within the last 10 years, and it looked like it was a young man. And I had somehow, I don't know if it was true or not, I felt like this was somebody who died in a motorcycle accident, but got buried right next to the church, right up. And I thought, oh, some family is still using this. So is there not a future in that part of the mission for burial? People still die.
So your question is, will people continue to be buried in those churchyards? Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Does that not give them a purpose?
Yes, maybe. I mean, I don't know. Las Trampas is a typical situation. I remember when we were having that meeting that I mentioned, asking for permission to do tours there. The mayordomos said, I'll have to check with the community. And Father Julio said, What community? There's only 4 people that I know of. So, and no, there's more people, huh? No, he meant the active Catholic people, the people who actively came to Mass. However, he meant the Catholic community. But the people in Las Trampas they stopped Masses at Trampas because there weren't enough people going to them. But now recently, they have Mass every 2 weeks because they've gotten 30 people, that was the minimum they gave them, to attend Mass. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I think the cemeteries will still be used as long as people live there. Will that create an emotional attachment to the places? In my own opinion, that in itself is insufficient. That and other connections to the church might be sufficient. You want to ask a question, then we'll go back here.
Yeah, I'm not going on the tour tomorrow, but I'm currently living in a neighborhood outside of Peñasco that they call them Llanos. And like you, I've noticed that the neighborhood Maradas are, that was a static in the speaker. That the neighborhood Maradas are all going strong. There's several of them up there. Yeah. But at the same time, there's several neighborhood Catholic churches that are not, that are abandoned. Yeah. And I've heard some people talk about applying for funds from state historical associations or something of that nature. And I was wondering if you know anything about that type of funding availability.
Hello? I know a little bit about it. When I went to Acoma and asked for permission to research, how are we doing for time?
Say another 10 minutes.
All right, I'll tell this in 1 minute. They asked me in exchange to provide a list of possible funding sources for restoration of their church. So I researched that and I put together a list and I gave it to them. But I wasn't happy with the list because I didn't have access to the Foundation Center, which is the main source for research and grants. So I contacted the college where I just retired from because I knew the lady in the grants office, and I said, can I use your password to go to the Foundation Center, research this thing? And she said, we can't give you the password, but we'll research it for you. I said, that's even better. Yeah, so I put together this list, and now I send it to everyone I have contact with, because people ask that question, and the list is just sitting there. So, but in my experience, no one ever applies. All right, I'll send you the list. We're neighbors, by the way. I live in Chamizal.
2 questions, Frank. One is, have the penitentes increased in the MORA area, and are they doing anything to take over these vacant or low attendance churches? The second question is, I notice in Espanola the expansion of evangelical Protestantism. It's just like in Mexico. And what impact is that having on the traditional Catholic traditions in the Espanola area?
The answer to the first question is the hermanos aren't involved in church restoration, and one reason for that is they also have to maintain their moradas. The moradas are the basis of the hermandad. It's like a private church for that religious group. However, in places like Cordoba, there are masses for the community at the morada. So they maintain the morada, but not the church. Your other question about Presbyterians in Espanola, I have no idea. I've seen in other places like Laguna, for example, where when you have conversion largely to Catholicism, and then the second church comes in, Presbyterians in this case, you get a split of the community, and that affects tradition, because at Laguna and most Indian pueblos, religious feast day, for example, is on the Saints' Day. And so you have religious tradition, you have Catholic tradition and local native traditions bound together in the traditional feast day and so on, celebrations of the community. When some people convert to Protestant churches, then they separate from that, and then the feast day no longer functions. You see that all over Latin America. That's happened. Yes. Excuse me.
I have several anecdotal things, but first of all, with all of these churches, which are part of the culture of New Mexico, we see this everywhere. We see it with big corporations buying up our hotels and homogenizing them so that the character and patina of the things that we used to have in Santa Fe, the charm and character that people come for, unless they don't know any better, it's not there anymore. And that's a very difficult thing. When you were talking about acceptance, I don't know, I've been accepted ever since I got here because I love it. But I was speaking to an elder in the neighborhood when I first got here, and he was treating me like a native. And so he was talking about what was going on in the neighborhood. And I said, well, you know, I've just recently come to Santa Fe, and I didn't realize that I was an Anglo. I hadn't known that. And so I said, so I have a question for you. I said, there are, of course, we have three cultures. We have the native, and we have the Hispanic, and now the Anglo. And I said, but what about other people like black people or people from other places in the world? And he said, oh, they're Anglos. So that was his response to that. But the other thing is, okay.
When Latin America was conquered, some blacks came with the Spaniards, and the Indians called them black white people.
But this is my favorite story, and every year at Easter, when they have Good Friday and they have the pilgrimage, it comes back to me. And I was watching it on television, and this television guy was interviewing the pilgrims. And so he stopped and he interviewed these teenage boys. And he said, well, now, can you tell me about your pilgrimage? And they had that lovely high lilt, you know, in the voice. And so, well, it's a family tradition, and we do it every year, and I've been doing it since I was a little child. And then he put his face right in the camera with this big grin, and he said, and it's a great way to meet chicks. And what I loved about it was, you know, this is all about death, and they're saying, we're talking about life here. And it was just a wonderful thing.
Yes, why don't you just pass it beside me?
Thank you. I'm with Cornerstone's Community Partnership, and we share a lot of very much similar philosophy on restoration. The difficulty sometimes is dealing with the cultural aspects of this, and also the youth, which, as you've aptly mentioned, has kind of dissipated and gone elsewhere. Our approach has been to partnership with the communities in restoring these buildings, and that community has waned so that we're left with fewer people, and it makes for a real challenge financially to restore. But we've always tried to engage the local community, and that's been the essence of it. And usually there's great spirit and desire, but a lack of manpower, so to speak. But the youth is another difficult thing to get a handle on, because typically when we're dealing with the locals, it's people of our age, maybe a little bit younger, but the youth are not always so readily available, and that's what the future hinges on, unless it's only a one-way supplement with income from the outside. No, it's not. So exactly. So we find ourselves up against a real difficult wall. So Help us out.
Well, I'm not sure that I can. You've identified the principal problem in historic church restoration is they used to be, like cornerstones would be a catalyst, let's say, for bringing together the community to work on the church, and maybe it would provide a little bit of resources and provide expertise, and would supply equipment. But the labor came from the community. Now, the communities, for reasons we mentioned, they're depopulated or they're not as Catholic as they used to be or whatever. There's just not that labor there. So then look what's happening now. You go to the next step, which is and this is happening in a few places I can think of. You say, okay, we'll hire labor. Now, as soon as Mac Watson is really sensitive about this because he has the tradition of this. As soon as you hire the first person to work on the church, nobody wants to work for free anymore. Okay, so now your labor's broken down. You try to fix it by hiring, and then you finish breaking down what was in the process of breaking down. In my personal opinion, the way it's going to have to go is hired labor because there just isn't enough. Oh, well, one thing that can happen is recruiting labor from the cities, right? People who are willing to go out and work. And I think a really overlooked resource is the university. I mean, there are so many kids who are strong and young and would be willing, if there was the appropriate internship or field work structure, who would be willing to do it. When the church fell down in Picoris, there were motorcycle clubs doing it. There were student groups. There's United World College in Las Vegas is another resource. They work on churches sometimes. So I think it's going to take, if you want to continue with volunteer labor, it's going to take new thinking to identify new sources of volunteer labor because the communities, they're too old and too few now to be expected to get up on scaffolding and do you have time for one more? Or did you want? We'll take two more. You go first and then we'll come back to you.
Okay, so that was getting to one of the things that I was thinking in terms of how you think about the community that gets engaged in these projects. And it sort of seems like everything that people are talking about is sort of, staying with the village as the community. Have there been efforts to try to think about community more regionally or exactly the sort of thing that you're talking about to sort of think about where others are? And I'm going to tag another one on, which is, you talked about insurance and, responsibility for maintenance and restoration. I'm wondering, this is probably not a small question and we can talk after, but I'm wondering if you could put that into the larger web of responsibilities, property, etc. What are the relationships between the local churches and the diocese? Who owns the property? Who owns the land?
Yeah. I mean, that's you've identified the crux of the problem. The archdiocese owns the properties, but doesn't take responsibility for maintaining them. It puts maintaining them on the parish. The parish washes its hands of maintaining the churches because there's too many and they don't have the resources. So they put it on the mayordomos and the community. And the community is so small, like we've been saying. Your other point about thinking of community in regional terms, that happens, right? But there's a real problem with it because if I come from my village to go to your village to work on your church, I still have my church to maintain, right? So it would require the reciprocal obligation of you coming to me, and I don't know if it's organized well enough, and mostly the response would be, if you want me to come to your church, I really can't do that because look at our church, I got my own problems. But despite that, I know of many cases where people from other villages, because they're friends or family or extended family, will come and work on a church that's not theirs. Last question.
several years ago, the San Miguel Chapel here underwent restoration, and as I recall, it was a grant from national organization, and they had college students down here making adobe bricks under supervision, and it was really quite wonderful. I'm wondering, you said they have this list of foundations, nobody applies for it. The people in the parishes probably don't know how to go about that, so I'm wondering if, I'm not involved in Cornerstones, but it sounds to me like that would fit in perhaps with their mission in helping the local parishes get the funds to enable Cornerstone to better accomplish its goal.
Well, one of the things that I tell people all the time is that when people need to apply for grant writing, especially for, what's it called, capital, what is it called when it's for a building? I can't remember. Capital improvement. They're so technical. They're just completely technical. And a normal person in a parish or a pueblo doesn't have the skill. I don't have the skills for that. And you have to get damage assessments before from architects and blah, 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 blah. So I always tell people, there's probably someone retired grant writer in Santa Fe who would know this stuff and be willing to help you. So if you know that person, I'll pass on the information. Thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate it.